Hello, Bill.
Hello, Matt. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Welcome to the DMZ, everyone.
Now, you've had a very un-DMZ 24 hours, I would say.
It has been un-DMZ, as un-DMZ-y as one can get, probably without a physical altercation. So, we don't do that, though.
For folks who don't know, you went into the den of MSNBC on Martin Bashir, talking about why Republicans are so relentless in their obstruction, and you began the conversation, I think, acknowledging Republicans need to have their own positive ideas. It can't just be negative all the time. It was kind of proceeding in kind of an interesting intellectual way, and then it all kind of went off the rails at the end.
Right. So, well, let's begin by saying, the caveat. As far as I'm concerned, Martin Bashir was fine to me as a host, and my adversary, Professor Dyson, isn't here to defend himself. So, I'm sure he has many outlets that he can do so if he wants to. What I'm about to say is...
You're the panelist with Professor Michael Eric Dyson, who is, I believe, an MSNBC contributor, and I think he even guest hosted a couple of times.
Yeah, no, he's definitely like a frequent guest, and honestly, I've never seen him not inject race into a discussion. That's his go-to move. So anyway, let me just start. This is my take on it for what it's worth. He's not here to give his side of it. He may do that at some point. So basically, what happened? I'll give you the play-by-play, Bill, because this thing did kind of blow up a little bit on Twitter and the sort of media websites and blogs like Mediaite and whatnot. So I was invited on to talk about, honestly, at first I wasn't sure what the topic was going to be, but at some point they told me that it was going to be, Republican obstructionism, which I think is a perfectly legitimate topic to discuss. For that matter, race is a perfectly legitimate topic to discuss in the right context. But so what happened is I start talking, and I guess the first question went to Crystal Ball, as I recall, and she gave her point. And then Martin asked me a question and a follow-up. And I believe in both instances I was interrupted by Crystal Ball, which is perfectly fine. Sometimes it's, if you just sort of wait your turn for the host to call on you, that's maybe more polite, but sometimes it's not as fun. So I really didn't mind that she interrupted me. I was like, okay, that's sort of how this is going to be. We're going to have like this free-flowing conversation. And, I did talk about things like, look, we have an adversarial system for a reason. The Founding Fathers put ambition against ambition. And, if Republicans are trying to block democratic ideas, that's sort of to be expected. I mean, in a way, that's their job. And you may dislike it, but both sides have been known to do this when the other party's in power. And and we were talking about some substantive issues like immigration reform, which, as I supported, and issues like Obamacare. And then it goes to Professor Dyson, who his go-to move is to play the race card, to inject race into it, and rather than having a substantive discussion about immigration reform or whatever, he starts to imply that Republicans are opposing this president based primarily on race. And I have to tell you, Bill, I did not plan on calling him on that. Like, I did not show up there. I didn't even know that was going to be a topic. Honestly, it wasn't a topic. It was apropos of nothing. But that's his go-to move is to talk about racism. And I guess, I've been in these situations many times, and the first million times somebody sort of injected race into the discussion, I let it pass. The 1,000,001st time was this time. And it was a matter of righteous indignation. I did not plan to do this. I just could not take it again because it was so bogus. And I see it as also hackneyed. It's both a cudgel and a crutch. It's a cudgel because the left uses it to beat Republicans with, obviously. But it's also a crutch because you don't have to be that smart or that knowledgeable about policy if you just want to accuse the other side of being racists. And it was so ridiculously apropos of nothing. It was such a non sequitur that I had to call him out. Now, the problem is, I did interrupt him. And in fairness to him, he hadn't interrupted me. It was Crystal who had interrupted me. So he was sort of sitting there by himself for 5 minutes, probably feeling a little bit out of the discussion. So when they do go to him, I did, in fairness, interrupt him. I think the mistake he made was in accusing me. So he said something about me using white privilege to shut him up or something. I think that was probably a bridge too far, and I think that's when I won the debate. I think that's when I won, when he accused me of white privilege for calling him out for injecting the race issue. That's my perspective. He would probably disagree. Bill, you probably disagree. I'll stop there, and we can take it.
I mean, as far as the... and I tweeted this last night, as far as the merits of the discussion, I basically agree with you that I mean, there's obviously an element of racism in some conservative circles, and I think you've acknowledged as much when this has come up in other areas. I mean,
Sure.
You can find the examples. That's not the same as saying the primary reason why congressional Republicans obstruct Obama so much.
Right,
is
Ted
race.
Cruz. Yeah, I mean, Ted Cruz did not, shut down the government because he's a racist against, Barack Obama. That's absurd.
And I mean, and I would argue that there was virulent opposition to Bill Clinton, to Harry Truman. Woodrow Wilson, you could argue perhaps the Republicans were not as relentlessly obstructionist, from end to end, but stuffing the Treaty of Versailles was probably the biggest act of obstruction in American history, short of the nullification in the Civil War era.
Yeah, Bill, I'm old enough to remember when they accused him of killing Vince Foster, Ron Brown,
right? Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton. I'm sorry. Back to Bill Clinton. He killed Vince Foster. He killed Ron Brown or Hillary. One of them dead. The Jennifer Flowers, Draft Dodger. I mean, there were. I don't think it was race. It's politics.
Right.
And they did the same. The other side did a similar, thing to George W. Bush.
Right,
and that's
I might argue it wasn't quite the same.
Okay, well,
but there was so plenty. I mean, there were a lot of judges that got filibustered under Bush. We blocked John Bolton from getting a permanent slot at the UN. It's not like nothing ever happened. I mean, there's a certain degree of hardball politics in any situation.
Well, look, and I mean, I didn't get to say this, and it might not have worked because it's one of my ridiculous football analogies, but this is an adversarial position, and Peyton Manning can't say, well, I didn't score any touchdowns today because the Redskins tried to stop me. No, Peyton Manning is so good that he scores touchdowns even when the opposition tries to stop him. He is that good, and that's what a really good president who's a strong leader can force people to support his agenda or override them by virtue of rhetoric and public support or just simply being right on the issue. You can't expect the other side to merely lay down and allow you to push through judges or your agenda or whatever. But we didn't. The discussion that we're having right now would have been a better discussion than the one that we ended up having.
Well, I mean, and you still had a lot of good discussion, I think, before that. So where I would quibble with you is, I mean, one, I think I think you interrupted him in a way that tried to cut off his point. I don't think Crystal's interruption to you was quite the same. Now,
that's probably fair. That's probably fair.
But in your defense, I mean, I take it you were doing this spontaneously. This wasn't a whole series of calculations in your mind or whatever. But I'm sure it's in some subconscious way. As a conservative on MSNBC, you can't sit there and just nod and smile while that kind of accusation is being hurled. I mean, if he got the last word and you were just the patsy sitting there, you would be, you'd be the ultimate rhino. So I get you. Yeah. You have
and it was essentially 3-1 is the other point too that no one brings up. it was, Martin Bashir, Crystal Ball, and Professor Dyson, and me, essentially. Now, the host, in this case, I think, he does play referee, and he sort of did try to call me out, even though I thought that Professor Dyson had been the one who sort of stepped over the line with the white privilege line. But it's not like Martin wasn't debating me and pushing back strongly on me, but you have to know that going in, I'm under the assumption this is a 3-against-1 move, and so I sort of need to talk 50% of the time if it's going to be a fair fight. I
mean, if the tables are turned, and I was on Fox in some sort of similar environment, what I might try. I mean, and again, I grant that is a spontaneous. You're not thinking things through. You have to act in the seat of your pants. So life isn't perfect. But I might have done like an initial interruption just to sort of lay my marker down. I think what you're saying is just fundamentally
Well, there is the
flawed.
thing. Well, there is the thing where if you wait your turn, you're never going to get to talk.
You might not get right. You might not get. So I get you can't just sort of just let it go completely, but you might have just sort of made an initial comment to break in, and then let him finish, and then hopefully you get your chance to respond more completely.
Yeah, and I think that Professor Dyson, first he went to the move, which was like, I didn't interrupt you, which is true. He didn't interrupt me. But then I said, but I didn't accuse anybody of racism or something like that.
Right, or you're trying to get that out.
And then I think he dropped the sort of nuclear bomb on accusing me of exercising my white privilege to shut him up or something. And that's when I think I won the debate. And that's when it sort of went off the rails. So, let me just also say, let me make this. I don't want to forget this, Bill, because this is such an obvious point, and it ties to something that you implied about how I couldn't sit still. There is nothing that pisses conservatives off more than being accused of racism.
Right.
It is.
And having a discussion about that, actually would have been interesting for you and Dyson to discuss.
Yeah.
If the temperature got scaled back a few degrees, it would have taken, I think, a lot more than the 2 minutes left in that segment that was probably allotted. But
look, don't get me wrong. I think that racism and race is a valid discussion. We've talked about it here on the show. But I don't think it's the only discussion to be had in the world. And I think in his case, it's his default move. He will inject race into any discussion. Habitually, I think race is one of the stories, one of the narratives in American history, clearly. I don't think it's the only story, and I think he does. I think he sees everything through that prism, and I think it's lazy, actually, because it means that we're never going to talk about the fact that, I made a point which I thought was quite interesting, which is that I actually supported immigration reform. And I think that the rollout of Obamacare has actually harmed the cause of comprehensive immigration reform. I know it was already in trouble anyway, as I've been saying. But I think anything comprehensive now is dead on arrival. And I think that there's some blame that goes to the way that Obamacare was rolled out. That's an interesting point, I think, and we could have discussed that. But it's much easier to accuse your opponents of being racist.
Well, where I think you're being a little hard on Dyson is, this is his job. He is a professor of sociology with a specialty in race. That's what he spends his life working on. If all you have is a hammer,
you think every problem's a nail.
That might be the situation, but
that's essentially what it is.
But I don't think he is. I think this is his way of looking at the world. I don't think it's totally fair just to dismiss him as trying to shut down all other debate because of it. It's just what his focus and interest is. So if he's going to be on a panel, he's probably going to talk about that.
I think that's a safe assumption, Bill. I think that's a really safe assumption that will be what he talks about. But again, you're right. I think you're right. A lot of it's baked into the cake. The people you have on a show will often determine how it goes. if I was debating Mark Halperin, we had a much different conversation, I'm sure.
Right. So, I think I would not call what he was doing, a playing of the race card. and trying to shut up everything else that you said. I just think that's where his focus lies. And so, I mean, I think, again, to repeat myself, I think you are correct that is not really the primary way to focus on Republican obstruction. I don't think that is the primary motivator. There are examples out there, but there's also more examples of conservatives getting very vitriolic at any liberal president once they get their mojo going. So that's not how I would look at it. But yeah. I think if MSNBC brought you back and Dyson back to have a 15-minute discussion on conservatives and race, I think it would be a very rich discussion. I don't think Dyson is by any means incapable of having a civil conversation about the subject. I just think in that format where he was shoehorning in the issue in a short time frame, you got blindsided and then things denigrated from there.
I think that's a very good point too. I mean, if it's me and Professor Dyson, sitting around a table at a panel discussion that's 30 minutes long, you probably have a much different conversation than, all right, Matt Lewis, 15 seconds left, real quick, what's going to, that sort of cable TV format where we're physically in different locations, and then there's another person on who is like not even part of that discussion. Cable TV, I think, sometimes can lend itself to these sort of things. And you're right, let's talk about the time element. So the first 7 minutes of the show, Professor Dyson wasn't even on. It's very possible, and I've had it happen before, where they go to him, he says his thing, and then the show wraps up. Then Martin could have been like, okay, well, thank you guys for being here. And I would have been left not pushing back. I would have been left sitting there, essentially as a prop, not pushing back on this, I think, incorrect and really unfair portrayal. So I do think that it was incumbent upon me to say something, and waiting for my turn to respond. That turn may or may not have happened. And so I bring that up because you do a lot of MSNBC and TV, Bill. But I think sometimes people who don't do it maybe don't fully appreciate. You're sitting by yourself alone in a room with these bright lights on you, this weird thing in your ear. And you may not exactly know when, you don't have the luxury of the Monday morning quarterback thing. You decide you're going to jump in or you're not going to jump in.
Seeing how long that segment had already gone, I think it's very possible you have not gotten another bite at the apple. I mean, when I go on, segments are usually about 7-8 minutes, and you get, 2 turns, and you already had a lot of turns, and Dyson hadn't had any.
Right.
So it's very possible that he would have had the last word if you hadn't jumped in. I do think that I think he was being too glib in throwing white privilege at you for an interruption, which happens on cable TV all the time, regardless of race.
And that really proved the point. But I will say, in fairness to him,
because it's such a sensitive subject, I think you could also be a little more delicate in how you respond to that, too.
Well, and I'll say in fairness to him, I mean, I had talked a lot. He had not talked a lot, and he starts talking, and then I interrupt him. And so from just a human standpoint, I can understand how that would be frustrating to him. And of course, you've already heard my side of it, so we don't have to go through that again. But anyway, very interesting. I will say the response to this bill has been really interesting. A lot of response. It's been really 50-50. I'm either a racist or, as my colleague Patrick Halley tweeted, Matt Lewis is God.
Well, like you said, I think this is a sore subject for conservatives.
An intern just hugged me, Bill.
Because
I was just hugged in my office. It's never happened before. I became a hero because this is something that conservatives are accused of and Republicans are accused of all the time, and it obviously gets under their skin. So it's like finally it's like the Jerry Maguire thing. Finally, someone said it. There's this slow clap as I walk in the office today, and someone says, he'll never be back on again. How long do you give him?
Look, and I get why conservatives are so agitated by that accusation all the time, and in some cases it is leveled far overly broadly or unfairly. But at the same time, there is this strain that's out there, and which you have been candid about in the past.
Yeah, well, I wrote a whole piece for the Week, Bill, where I called out the racism that was stopping immigration reform, and I actually showed emails and tweets that had been sent to me from people who were literally saying that the reason they were against that is because they think that America should be a white country, that Hispanics are not mentally capable of governing, of democracy. It was just horrible things. So, yeah, you're right. There is certainly an element out there. Now, you could play the other...
Go on.
Well, I was going to say, you play the other side of the coin and talk about, Robert C. Byrd being a Klan member. You could talk about Abe Lincoln being a Republican.
That's kind of where I was going to go with that, because I feel like if conservatives just dealt with the history as it is and didn't try to blur things so much to try to, say you guys do it too. I mean, the actual history is that, racism was more a Democratic thing than a Republican thing in the Civil War era when Lincoln was the guy. But those tectonic plates shifted over time. And the Democratic Party essentially split over the issue between Hubert Humphrey. Well, FDR was sort of a beginning of black support coming to the Democratic Party. Hubert Humphrey pushed civil rights in 1948, which was very touchy, which led Strom Thurmond to run independent. LBJ kind of sealed the deal with the Civil Rights Act, and all those Southern Democrats who were more racist left the party for the most part, and Nixon scooped them up, and that sort of changed the nature of the two parties. And Byrd was just kind of one of those stragglers who didn't leave, but he also reformed his views on race too. And so when I see Republicans just go Byrd, and I think other liberals like this too, that says to us, you guys are not owning up to the actual historical trajectory here.
Well, the interesting thing was, I don't know if you remember, but when Rand Paul spoke at Howard University, he made some of these points and was surprised that the students knew. They actually sort of knew the history. I think there's an assumption on the right. Now, granted, these are college students, so they may not represent the public at large, but I think there's an assumption on the right that a lot of African Americans, and a lot of just Americans in general, don't understand that it's much more complicated and nuanced. And, we have presidents like Eisenhower, who was really good on civil rights, and was it Reagan who signed the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday? I mean, you could certainly go through and pick and choose different things to show. And there's moments like, where Kennedy makes a phone call, Nixon doesn't, that change things. I think Martin Luther King had been a Republican. You can go through and talk about those things. I think Republicans assume that Democrats don't know, but certainly the students of Howard knew that history. So much for, every once in a while you'll hear this idea that Republicans should just run ads telling people that Lincoln was a Republican, and that alone will solve the problem. I mean, I think that, it's again, I do want to say, I do believe that race is certainly a valid discussion. And we've had that. I just think that it's not every discussion, and it doesn't need to be injected in every debate. And I think to do so is cheap and also sort of a form of escapism. I mean, Democrats need to sort of really wrestle with the fact right now that Obamacare is enjoying a 31% approval rating, according to the CBS poll. And if you blame racism for that, well, how do you explain the fact that Barack Obama was elected twice?
Well,
by the same people who now oppose
I totally agree. I mean, anything that's sort of fundamentally factually inaccurate can cause you problems. If you're going to blame everything, and I don't think most liberals do this. But you do hear from some of the left to pointing a finger at racism for a lot of sins that are not primarily about racism when it comes to Obama. And if you're going to try to diffuse issues, for example, if in 2016 Obamacare is just not working, I don't think it's what's going to happen, but let's just say it's hypothetical. Obamacare is not working. If the Democratic response is you're all racist, that's not going to save the day in choice, because most people are going to be like, why don't you make Obamacare work and not try to shift the blame? So if it got that far, yeah, that would be a big problem for Democrats. I don't think it's going to be like that, but yeah, you have to ward that off. On the Republican,
but I do think there's nothing kills debate and discussion quicker. I mean, we could have had a substantive debate about policies, and somebody could have said, don't you think that, Republicans should have maybe fought Obamacare before it became law? But once it became the law, don't you think it's incumbent upon them as good citizens to then support its implementation to try to help Americans who don't have health care? That would have been a much tougher thing for me to respond to, and I would have had a response. But that would have been a harder and I think more interesting comment. But when you throw race into every discussion, I think it undermines you're essentially attacking the credibility and the personhood of your debate partner, and I think it really ruins the chance that you're going to have an honest discussion about the actual substance.
Well, and when that's
that's why it was visceral. My reaction was
and I think when that happens,
I think clearly, I'm not a good actor.
When that happens, and it's sort of patently not the issue, the person injecting race in the conversation is probably the one who's going to lose the argument. But there are other cases, like immigration, for example, where the anti-immigration side is trying so hard to insist that they're not being racist. And I don't think getting very far with that, because there are so many instances where conservatives seem to be going out of their way to be dismissive, to embrace a politically incorrect view, to embrace a guy like George Zimmerman, for example. Or sort of hanging their hat on the Harry Burt thing over and over again, and not acknowledging what other kind of racist tactics were done by Republicans, starting with Nixon. All that stuff, I think, undermines Republican credibility when it counts on an issue that does relate to race. And of course, and that's obviously very frustrating for conservatives that want to break out of that. So I think there is more conservatives can do to own up to stuff and to call out stuff that happens on their side of the aisle, and there's more Democrats could do to stay focused on the issues at hand when there are non-race issues that need to be addressed with straight up.
I agree, Bill, and that's why when there was a guy a couple of years ago at National Review who wrote something that was inappropriate about race, and I called him out. And I try to do that because, and sometimes conservatives don't like it, even if they disagree with what the person's saying, that they don't want you to, it's like the left is going to take care of that. I'm of the opinion that we do need to police our own side, and I hope that gives me a certain amount of credibility when I get into these situations, because I want to call out bad behavior on both sides of the aisle. And so if I see a conservative or a Republican, who's prominent, saying or doing something that I think is racist, pretty much try to go out of my way to publicly call them out. But when I see someone on the other side playing the race card in a different way, hopefully that gives me more credibility to call them out, because I just think it's a divisive issue, and when people exploit it, for their political purposes, whether it's using it as a dog whistle or using it to shut down debate and discussion. It's not helpful.
That's why I think it was sort of too bad about what happened yesterday on MSNBC, because I doubt most members of the audience knew your history calling out other conservatives on race. And again, that's why I think you and Dyson could probably have a really interesting discussion that actually would bridge a lot of gaps if given the time and the space.
Oh, I'm sure. Look, if he could have, maybe we'll do it someday. But I'm sure, like, if we had done a blogging heads and we had like an hour discussion like you and I have, some of it's the environment. Cable TV is the environment is sort of set up to have these conflicts, and I think it's good TV. Now the mistake is I won the debate, and that was probably the mistake. But otherwise, these things are good TV. It gets people talking. So hopefully, it's good for ratings.
Well, let me shift gears to what.
I'm not accusing them of exploiting the issue for ratings, but hopefully, maybe it'll start a discussion.
Let me transition to another element of Republican obstruction, which might come to a head. It might come to a head before this even gets uploaded on Blogging Heads TV. The filibuster of judges, which looks because Reid now, the Senate Majority Leader Reid is now suggesting he is going to force a rules change that would end judicial filibusters for all levels, save for a Supreme Court, and do so through a simple majority vote, not the traditional two-thirds vote for rules changes, which often gets called the nuclear option. And I have a lot to say about this, but I want to give you first crack. Do you think Republicans have dug their own grave here because they're being unreasonable about seating the nominations that Obama's already proposed by their own admission, not regardless of the merits of the candidates themselves? Or are Democrats looking for an excuse to do a quick power grab that's going to bite them in the butt later on down the line?
I have a lot to say about this, too. So first of all, I think that what we've seen happen is essentially what Iran's doing. I mean, let's use the nuclear analogy, right? The Democrats got to what's latent potential, where they have a breakthrough capacity. So what I'm saying with that is they don't have the nuclear bomb, but they've had the ability to create the nuclear bomb in a matter of days for a long time. And they've used it. They've used the threat of going nuclear, which in itself is a form of going nuclear, or nuclear, if you're W. They've used so they've already sort of been using this, and it is interesting that we have the nuclear analogy because they've sort of like have the latent ability, we talked about this last week when you were out, but I argue that having the ability to go nuclear is almost as good, maybe better than going nuclear. So this is rank hypocrisy on both sides. Whoever's in the majority threatens to do this, and whoever's in the minority says it's horrible. Harry Reid, 7 years ago or something, said Republicans want to break the rules to change the rules. Now, of course, he's changed his tune on it. Republicans are being obstructionists. That's to be expected. It's not just that they're the party of no, but look, if you're, Marco Rubio is going to block the Fed appointment, for example, he believes that she's wrong on monetary policy. That's to be expected. Maybe in the old days they were more cordial, and if you lost an election, you would just let the other side put somebody in. But I think you could argue that a U.S. senator has every right to block somebody that, even if they're qualified, that they disagree with philosophically. My last point is simply to say that I believe there is a very good chance that Republicans will take the Senate next year or in 2014. If I were betting today, I would bet that Republicans will take the Senate. And so Democrats may want to think twice about whether or not they do this. That's all I have to say.
Let me just pick up. I won't go point for point. I'll just take it from where you leave off. Yeah. So let's.
Okay.
So I won't get into all the are they hypocrites or not stuff. Let's just talk about.
I think we can concede they're hypocrites.
I don't agree, but I don't want to go 10 rounds on that. But I think this might be a little bit more novel. So are Democrats taking a risk by going nuclear? Are they going to hurt themselves at the end of the day? Because someday there'll be a Republican president. I mean, it's one thing to lose the Senate in 2014. They need to have the president and the Senate to start, loading up the judiciary with their own brand of judges. Just losing the Senate isn't enough for them. So the earliest Republicans could start turning the tables is 2017. Now, I wrote a post on this yesterday because I actually didn't know what is the state of the judiciary now. How many judges does each side have today?
It's about equal. Well, that's the point. It's about equal, and Democrats.
Well, this is it. Let's sort of explain the history here. So when Obama came in, Republicans had 60% of the federal judiciary, and that does not count judges who are not considered active but have senior status. And when you have senior status, you still rule on cases sometimes. You're just not as active. And Republicans have a I think a 2/3 advantage there because you have a lot of Reagan appointees that are still kind of lingering in the system as of today. When Obama came in on the active judges, it was 60-40. And even though Obama's confirmation rate is lower than Bush and Clinton's, Bush and Clinton had about 90%, Obama's got about 75%. So even though he's been slowed, he has successfully made up the lost ground, and now it's about dead even. Actually, just this month, Obama got one seat up. So it's now at 50.06% Democratic control of the judiciary. So you could, you could stop there and say, well, you're a parity, you shouldn't get any more. But typically, there's a lot of churn in the lower levels of the judiciary. It's not like they don't stay for 50 years the way Supreme Court judges do. And so presidents usually get to replace about 40% of the entire judiciary if they have a two-term presidency. So if Obama was sort of operating at normal levels, he'd be ahead of the game where he is today. He used to be up ground. It's not bad, but typically he'd be having a much bigger leg up. And then if the next time a Republican president came along, they would dial it back. That's the way the pendulum tends to swing. So right now he's being sort of kept at a ceiling where if he was stuck there when a Republican president came along, they would really get to swing the pendulum back. So you have, so right now you're at about even parity but you still have Republicans with an edge with the senior status judges. And you have 93 vacancies out of about 874. So it's a little over 10% of the judiciary is unfilled. So the choice of the Republicans now is you could just do what past minorities do and let most of the guys get through. And Obama would not fill all of those 93. Even as it stands, he only has nominations for half of them in the queue. But he would get more. He would go beyond parity at the end of the day. Or what they're doing right now is they're drawing this line in the sand saying you should not get to fill any of the seats on the D.C. circuit, which is considered the most important circuit below Supreme Court. You should not get to tip the balance on that panel. The vacancy should sit there. And it doesn't matter what the qualifications or philosophies of your judges are. That's it. That's forcing Democrats to say, fine, well, that's going to make us go nuclear. If at that point, Obama will, if they go nuclear and there's no filibuster, it'd be easy for him to say, okay, I'm doing the whole 93. I get them all. I'm gonna get. He would end up with about 55% of the judiciary, and he'd have a lot of young folks in there that will eventually replace the Reagan judges at that senior status level. So they may get a very long period of Democratic dominance. Whereas, because Republicans escalated the issue, whereas if they stood down now, Obama would get some leg up, but it would be easier to swing it back once Republicans had their turn. So that's why I think at the end of the day, Republicans are miscalculating if they take it this far. But I admit I feel like people just don't know the numbers here. People don't know what the state of play is and what the potential bounty is. So I think that's interesting.
Well, I guess I'm at the point where it's like a bully picks on you and they're threatening to do something to you. Just bring it on. Let's quit threatening us. Harry Reid, you want to keep talking about the nuclear option? You want to break the rules to change the rules, as you said? Go ahead and do it. Just do it. Bring it on. So, look, I understand why Republicans are doing it. This is important. I mean, the judiciary is right now almost evenly split. These judges have a huge impact. I mean, this could be a really lasting legacy. And, the impact that they have on things, issues like regulations, whatever, it really matters. And so I think it's probably good. If you're a conservative, you want to stop the number of judges who are appointed. You don't want there to be this, 60% Democrat appointees on the bench. So I think Republicans are probably doing the right thing, what they were elected to do. And if Harry Reid wants to break the rules, then he's going to have to do it. Just quit threatening. Just do it, Harry. That's my message. But be prepared because there is a reasonable chance that Republicans will one day again have the president and the Senate. And then, it'll be easier to, repeal Obamacare or whatever they want to do. And I'm sure Democrats then will be whining and complaining about precedent and the tyranny of the majority. And then, I'm sure there'll be a lot of people on the different sides of that issue again. It'll be hypocrisy once again.
Well, I saw this debate go on over Twitter between David Freddoso. I think he's at the Weekly Standard. Is that right? Or is it the Examiner?
No, he was at the Examiner. I think he still writes for the Examiner sometimes, but he has his own thing going too. He's a really smart reporter and journalist.
So he was making the case on Twitter, do it and we'll repeal Obamacare in 2017. And Greg Sargent of the Washington Post was saying, why should we think you guys wouldn't do that anyway? Why should you make a stand down now when we should fully expect you to break all the rules you want when you get in charge because that's been your want before? And I actually don't agree with either position there as far as what I think would actually happen. So the Democrats can say as a technical matter, well, Reid's only changed the rules for judicial filibusters below the level of Supreme Court. You'd have to do something else to expand the end of the filibuster to cover everything. And Republicans say, well, you've already broken the precedent, so breaking more precedents is right. A distinction without a difference. And then the Greg Sargents say, well, you guys don't care about the precedents anyway, so I should assume you're going to reach that point regardless. And I feel like politicians will do what they can get away with, period. And there is this thing that remains called democracy and elections, which is somewhat constraining on a series of power grabs. So the judicial issue is interesting because it's an issue that most people don't care about. And it tends to be a fight between the two political bases that focus on it more intently. And in theory, you can get away with more aggressive behavior because most folks aren't really watching. And what has generally constrained both sides at the end of the day, we haven't had an actual breakdown of the filibuster yet, is a certain degree of Senate love of the institution
Right.
the place that sort of sands down the rough edges of the House and makes sure the pendulum doesn't wildly swing left to right. So it makes the Senate special. If it was just a majoritarian institution, you wouldn't really need two houses. You could just have one house, and that would be the end of it. So there's always that class there that has kept the lid on it. And there also, I think, is a sense that that it's not good, to have wild swings in the judiciary. You want to have a sense of stability. If the judiciary itself gets politicized, that sort of weakens the foundations of American democracy. So that's kind of kept that in check. And as far as legislation goes, sure, you could play the nuclear option card and go repeal Obamacare, but they're going to have to ask us in 2017, is that going to be a politically wise thing to do after it's been in place for 3 years, after insurance companies have completely rejiggered their business models to adapt to it, after millions of people get insurance that didn't have it before? If they want to try it because Reid got 93 judges in the judiciary through his rules change, try it. I would suspect that there's going to be a lot of pressure, not least from the insurance industry, making them not do that. I mean, there are other factors at play that are going to be a constraining influence on dramatic, radical changes. I mean, radical change on either side of the aisle just doesn't happen very often because there's always inherent political risk to it. I mean, even something like Obamacare, which I would argue is a pretty mild reform as far as the history of reforms go, obviously comes with a lot of political risk involved because any kind of change change is a great slogan, but tougher to implement.
Right.
So do on the
let me make a sort of an unintended consequences argument here too. Not the primary point of this, but we have seen that the Senate is changing. And so you have people like, Cruz and Paul, and who are not really institutionalists. They shake things up and they break protocol. And I think we probably agree there's some problems with that. That it could be refreshing, but also that there is something nice about having the Senate be this more august, slow, the saucer that cools the tea upper chamber, and that having some civility up there is a good thing. One thing that could happen is, now, as you mentioned, the reason this hasn't happened is that there's senators like John McCain who, when Republicans were in the majority, people like John McCain said, well, I might not be in the majority next year, though. And so we need to come together and not go nuclear because today it might help me, but tomorrow it might hurt me. It seems like once the old guard either is outnumbered or just throws up their hands and gives up and agrees to go nuclear, which they may be at that point now where there are enough votes. Democrats just need a simple majority vote. Once that happens, I think it could have the unintended consequence of really thinning out the Senate so that no matter how much tenure you have, once you're in the minority, you could be like a long-serving, high-ranking senator with a lot of experience. Once you're in the minority, you would really be neutered. You would not have nearly as much power as you currently have to affect public policy or slow things down that you don't like. I think you would start to see more and more of the old guard leaving, just retiring, go to lobbying, go back home, whatever, out of just frustration that they can't affect change. They're in the minority. They may be for a long time. Now, maybe that's a good thing. You get some. It's like a sort of term limits effect where you get new blood in, or maybe you feel like there's something lost by that. But I do think it's possible that an unintended consequence of this could be that you have more and more Ted Cruz's and less John McCain's.
Well, that also could go the other way because if you essentially had a defunct filibuster, which is the basic card the minority has to play, if that's gone, then you don't have any power at all unless you find a way to work with the majority. So being a bomb thrower at that point is totally meaningless. It gives you nothing. You only get anything by cutting deals. So I wonder if it would have a different effect.
That's an interesting point, Bill. That is a very interesting point. This maybe will develop into a column for the week for you.
Maybe
there's something there.
Well, speaking of the week, if I could do our weekly self-promotion. So I had a piece up yesterday entitled "Why the Left is Terrified of a Hillary Coronation," because I thought that we've been hearing this, there was a New Republic piece about Hillary's nightmare, Elizabeth Warren, that the Democratic Party is changing and becoming more populist and more suspicious of Wall Street, and the Clintons have had a lot of Wall Street ties, and that's going to give Hillary agita in the new Democratic Party. Warren is being pretty adamant, saying she's not running, but Bernie Sanders, who is technically not a Democrat, he's independent, who caucuses with Democrats, he's making some noise about running. If nobody else steps up to raise progressive issues, and there's a plausible chance that I could win, I might do it, whether it's third party, whether it's the Democratic primaries, I don't know. And you have Marin O'Malley, who's a lesser name, the former governor of Maryland, who's, he's just spoken in New Hampshire, he's cutting biographical videos, he's certainly positioning himself, whether he'd actually challenge Hillary or not is unknown, but he's certainly making some moves. And you at minimum see an appetite in certain corners of the left for this challenge, which I imagine to some folks, they might be saying, what is this coming from? I mean, Hillary's miles ahead in the primary. She's got a leg up on all the Republican possibilities. She is as qualified and as vetted as could possibly be. She has no glaring policies that are wildly out of step with the mainstream of the Democratic Party. You can quibble about this vote or that vote, but on the whole, she's basically a Democrat. So where is it coming from? And what I try to answer in the piece is it's not that these folks on the left are dead set on beating Hillary, which would probably is just not a good bar to try to clear, because that's probably not what's not going to happen. I mean, obviously anything's possible. Polls are early, yada, yada, yada. But she's got a pretty strong hold, I think, on the Democratic electorate at this point. Far different than 2008, I would argue. But so it's not a question of beating her per se. It is, can we make sure she doesn't win via coronation, because then she doesn't owe anybody anything. If she hasn't had to make any pledges to the people at large, to certain constituencies, if she doesn't have to say, I will refuse all Social Security cuts, I'm gonna go even harder on Wall Street, I'm gonna adopt this set of rules, the regulations on Wall Street, I'm going to veto any further cut in spending, or I will not allow sequestration to last one more day. If you can't get any kind of pledge like that out of her, and she wins, then you just don't know what she might do. And there's a degree of that regardless of what pledges they take. But once presidents get in there, all sorts of wiggle room gets created. So there's never anything that's foolproof. But there's a certain logic on the progressive side to say, let's try to pin her down as much as possible. And as I argue in the piece, I think what these progressives are advocating are not things that are detrimental to a general election. It's not like pulling Romney so far on the anti-immigration side of the ledger that you lose a bunch of Latino votes that you might have gotten. If you make Hillary say no Social Security cuts, you don't really lose any votes taking that kind of pledge. So I think what they're doing is really good.
That's a really good point, Bill, and I think you're right. And what would Frank Underwood do if he were? This is the House of Cards guy.
Oh, I don't watch House of Cards.
All right, so Kevin Spacey, you gotta watch this on Netflix. Kevin Spacey.
I'm at 2007 in my pop culture. I will get there.
This is worth your time. Season 2 is going to come out soon. You can catch up by just going to Netflix and watching Season 1. Great show, but Frank Underwood, played by Kevin Spacey, is the majority whip, and he. This is the perfect sort of thing for him. He would see this and he would find a way to make Hillary face opposition, which would force her. Then he would come in as the savior. She wouldn't know that he was behind all of her troubles. He would come in as the savior to help her, and then she would owe him a favor. That's a Frank Underwood move. It's so Machiavellian.
But I assume Underwood
that
has
raises.
So go on.
Well, that raises the question: like, is there going to be a Frank Underwood effort, like, to make that happen? It's one thing for the left to wish or to hope that she needs them. Could they find a way to make her need them, whether it would have happened organically or not?
Right. I mean, and I think the difference here is that you don't have this coming from Nancy Pelosi or Harry Reid or Barack Obama or any other top congressional Democrat. This is not coming from the Democratic establishment trying to put some roadblocks in her path. This is coming from some of the outside groups, and they don't carry. The only leverage they carry is on the potency of the issue that they push, not out of, a collection of chits they have by being, an elected official. So the question that I think the left has to ask themselves
My light tells me we're almost to the 1 hour mark, Bill.
That's true. I'll wrap up.
No, I'm not rushing you. I'm just telling you.
I think there's clearly evidence that the no Social Security cuts message, for example, has a lot of resonance. Democrats who have played that, get very far with it, and the deficit scolds in Washington that kind of tut at it really don't have a lot of juice at the grassroots level. So how do you best play that card? Is it better to play it using a primary challenge as your vehicle, or is the issue better used, after a primary? Because the risk is if you have a primary challenge that can't get more than 30%, that might diminish the agenda that's being put forth. And maybe it's less a concern of Social Security because there's some sort of deep support there, but maybe if Elizabeth Warren was pushing the restoration of Glass-Steagall, for example, which is a bigger thing to expect Hillary to embrace, she might have her own package of Wall Street reform that doesn't go as far as bringing back Glass-Steagall. If you want to try to pull Hillary your way on that, but you can't get more than 30% for a primary candidacy, well, you might be exposing the fact that issue is maybe too obscure and doesn't have the mass resonance that you thought it did. So maybe you want to find a more clever way to push it than a primary challenge. I think that is kind of a tougher question to answer, but that's the downside of what progressives who want this are risking. I don't think they're risking Hillary's defeat. I don't think they're pushing anything that's going to make her life all that complicated. It might be unpleasant to be asked, why do you want to continue your husband's failed Wall Street deregulation? Why do you want to continue your husband's failed welfare reform? Stuff like that. She might have to dance a little bit, but I think that's a manageable challenge for her to deal with. It's not like being forced to say, I'm for self-deportation, which is much more devastating in general. And I think Hillary is so far ahead at this point that I don't think she has to be all that fearful about it. I think she's paid her dues. She's got the perfect resume. She has the historic element as far as being a potentially first woman president going for her. There's a lot going her way that I think she shouldn't have to be Machiavellian to try to snuff out a challenge in its crib. She can say, look, bring it on. I can take it. Let's have a debate. Toughen me up. I'll answer your questions. I'll show everyone I'm not afraid, and I'll move on. So I don't think this is like a point of high drama for the Democrats, but I do think it's maybe somewhat illuminating to explain why it might be that some liberals will be doing this. They are trying to find a way to maintain a degree of leverage in the Clinton presidency, and a leverage that some feel they did not have with Obama, because in many ways Obama did not owe them for he won on the power of his own campaign structure and his own personality, and did not owe a lot of constituencies things. With Hillary, there might be more of a case because if she doesn't face any kind of primary challenge at all.
Well, the whole doing favors thing is interesting. I'm reminded of Lyndon Johnson loved to do people favors so that they would then owe him. I will tell you something I learned from reading Chris Matthews' book Hardball, which is fabulous, by the way, for those who haven't read it, which is sort of counterintuitive, but I found it to be very true, is if you want people to like you, it's better to let them do you a favor than to do them a favor, which is counterintuitive. But if you think about it, let's say there's a young intern here at the Daily Caller. If they ask me to do a favor for them, like for their, write a letter of recommendation or speak for a group of theirs, well, how does that make me feel? The first thing is I'm sort of flattered that they came to me. And then there's like this sort of mentorship. I'm invested in their success. And so that's counterintuitive. You would think that you would be put off. Like, oh, they keep asking me for favors. So that might be something else that someone like Hillary could do to preempt this, is to go to some of these groups and ask them for something. Now, it could backfire. The dynamics aren't exactly the same. They may say, well, what are you going to do for us if it's a quid pro quo sort of thing? But I do find that interesting, and I do think it works, certainly at the micro level, but I suspect that it's the kind of thing that might even help Hillary. Because another thing I think that Matthews talks about is the thing people really hate is being ignored. People don't, almost don't mind if you say bad things about them. They prefer that to being ignored. And, a lot of politics is about going out of your way to bring people in and make them feel a part of what you're doing. And so Hillary could possibly preempt some of this stuff by, going to these groups proactively and asking for their input, their advice, helping her craft ideas. There may be a way to minimize the danger of this hurting her.
Well, I think everybody expects, at minimum, that she's not going to go on the stump and say, "Hey, lay off those good guys on Wall Street. They have lots of interesting ideas you should listen to." That's not going to be her campaign message. She's going to probably take a pretty.
That was her husband's campaign message.
She's probably going to take a more populist line in her rhetoric. The question is, to what extent is that going to be rhetoric, and to what extent is that going to be a hard pledge to do X, Y, or Z? And to the extent that there's gray area there, how far does she need to go to minimize a challenger from really picking up a lot of steam? I think she has a lot of latitude, so I think it's going to be very hard to really pin her down. So
you're doing what's called on the left concern trolling. Glad you're concerned, Bill. No, look, that's what we do. This could happen. This is a valid column idea, but I think I suspect.
But the challenge on the left is, can you find no Social Security cuts is easy. That's a sort of time tested thing. Is there? I think making her take a position on Glass-Steagall is probably a lot harder, and she probably wouldn't do it. She should have her own package of reforms, and she would say this is just as good or better for whatever reason. Is there
that would even be an idea popular with a lot of conservatives
to take on Glass-Steagall, to embrace it the way?
I think so.
Yeah, I mean, I know McCain has, and I know David Vitter has been kind of leaning in that direction. To say this is about being anti-bigness and being pro-competition, as opposed to being pro-regulation and big government, as a way to make that a conservative issue. So the question is, are there other issues that you can craft in a way that make it hard for Hillary to beg off? I think that's a challenging thing to design. What happened in the primary in 2008 was, and this is a lot of the people that I work with at Campaign for America's Future, we helped craft the public option, which was an idea that was hatched by a professor named Jacob Hacker, and that was then sold to Obama, Clinton, Edwards, and Edwards grabbed it first, and Obama and Clinton followed suit to varying degrees, and that helped shift the policy discussion. Is there an idea like that would be too hard for Hillary to run away from. I don't know if how close the left is to coming up with stuff like that.
Well, good stuff to keep an eye on. I'm glad we had a nice civil discussion here, and that you didn't walk off the set, or I didn't yell at you, or anything.
Although I think I interrupted you about 15 times.
I interrupted you. I always interrupt you, but it's part of the give and take of the show. It's what we do. You think Tony Kornheiser and Michael Wilbon don't interrupt each other?
I poorly conditioned you for the MSNBC environment. I got you too used to impolite behavior.
You set me up. Let me just say, I'm going to enjoy the next 24 hours of being a conservative rock star, because I'm sure I will do something that will piss them off, my base off in the next 24 to 48 hours. But in the meantime, I will be celebrated as Rush Jr. So good times. Enjoy your run. I will.
And we can talk next week. Well, we'll have to work on next week because of Thanksgiving and all.
We need to talk about if we're going to do a special Thanksgiving Day or show or something.
Yeah, so we'll figure it out.
All right. One of our people will talk to your people.
Until then, have a good week.
You got it. See ya.